They told me not to speak to anyone. My daughter leaned toward me on the cruise ship deck, her hand pressed firmly on my arm, and with that rehearsed voice that sounds like kindness but tastes like command, she whispered, "Please, Mom, don't talk to anyone. Not the staff. Not the neighbors at the dinner table. Not strangers who might sit beside us at the pool. It's better that way. You'll be more comfortable." I remember staring at the white rail. The ocean stretched so wide it seemed endless, and thinking how odd it was that silence had suddenly been prescribed to me as if it were a medicine, as if the simple act of speaking were dangerous, contagious, or shameful. I am 78 years old, a retired teacher who spent most of her life shaping words into lessons, coaxing shy children to speak, insisting that their voices mattered, and now here I was, instructed to be a quiet shadow, a polite accessory for family photographs, a living prop in someone else's version of perfection. I live alone these days, in a modest apartment with thin walls where I hear the footsteps of strangers above me and the hum of traffic outside. But I had allowed myself to believe that this trip might be different, that traveling with my daughter and her family might offer me not just the scenery of foreign coasts, but the warmth of belonging, the chance to be folded back into the center of their lives even for a few days. The cruise had been her idea, of course, a grand gesture wrapped in brochures and promises. She had called me one evening, her voice unusually bright, telling me they had booked cabins for the whole family, and wouldn't it be wonderful if I joined? I said yes immediately, perhaps too quickly, because when you are often alone, invitations feel like rescue ropes thrown from a ship passing by. I packed carefully, ironing blouses that still carried the faint smell of cedar from the wardrobe, folding skirts I had not worn in years, and even buying a wide-brimmed hat that made me laugh at myself in the mirror. I imagined us sitting together at dinners, walking on the deck under the stars, perhaps even talking about the past or the future in those rare moments when families remember they are more than logistics. I imagined my granddaughter asking me about school, about the books I once wrote, about her grandfather whom she never met. I imagined being needed, if only for stories, if only for presents. But on the very first day, before the ship even left the harbor, I was told not to speak. There is a particular humiliation in being silenced by those who owe their very language to you. I taught my daughter to read. I was the one who sat beside her at the kitchen table, tracing letters on paper, clapping when she managed her first sentence, and later encouraging her to stand tall in school recitals when her voice shook. I gave her words, and now she returned them to me as a locked box I was not allowed to open. She said it quietly so that others would not hear, but the command was sharp enough to slice through any illusion I had that this journey was meant for closeness. It was not. It was for display, for the photographs they would share online, for the curated family image in which I was included only as long as I remained silent, harmless, unnoticeable. I stood there on the deck, the wind tugging at my coat, and tried to swallow the sting of it. Around me, families bustled with excitement. Children pointed toward the gulls circling overhead. Couples leaned against the railing with arms entwined, and staff members walked briskly in their uniforms preparing for departure. Everyone seemed to have a place, a role, a purpose. Everyone except me, who was instructed to occupy space without sound, to exist without expression. It was not the first time, of course. Silencing had come in many forms over the years. In the way my son once told me not to correct his children's grammar because it made them self-conscious, in the way my daughter-in-law rolled her eyes when I offered to cook, in the way neighbors asked polite but disinterested questions and moved on before I could answer. Old age, it seems, trains the world to press a finger to your lips before you even open them. But hearing the order spoken aloud, here on this shining ship that was supposed to carry us to joy, was like a slap that left no mark but burned nonetheless. I am not naive. I know that families grow busy, that the young circle around each other and forget the ones who once stood at the center. I know that aging makes one slower, less efficient, perhaps even tiring to those who measure worth in productivity and quick wit. But I also know the difference between natural distance and deliberate erasure. This was the latter. My daughter's eyes had that flicker of warning when she said it, that unspoken message: do not embarrass us. Do not remind anyone that you exist, outside the lines we have drawn for you. I nodded, because that is what mothers do when they are cornered between dignity and peace. But inside I felt the old muscles of resistance twitching. As the ship prepared to leave the port, an announcement rang out over the loudspeaker, cheerful, ceremonial, the kind of voice that fills the air with importance. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming our guest of honor for this voyage, Mrs. Evelyn Grant. My name, my full name, spoken clearly, rolling out into the salt air. For a second I thought I had misheard, or that there was another Evelyn on board, but then I saw heads turn, people clapping politely, and the cruise director gesturing toward me with an open smile. My daughter froze, her hand tightening on my arm, her mouth curving into a brittle grin. "That must be a mistake," she hissed, but the applause was real. The eyes were on me, and in that moment, after being told to remain invisible, I was suddenly illuminated. I did not know how or why they had chosen me. Perhaps someone had read the small note I filled out on the passenger form, where I had written, "Retired teacher, 40 years in the same school, author of children's readers." Words I barely thought mattered. Perhaps it was random. Perhaps it was mercy. Perhaps it was simply an administrative accident. But the fact remained. My name was in the air, acknowledged, honored, and no amount of shushing could erase it. For a moment I felt taller, steadier, as though the sea itself had risen to hold me. My daughter's embarrassment radiated from her like heat. But for once, it did not burn me. It only reminded me that my existence was not confined to her instructions. Still, I played along. I smiled softly. I inclined my head. I let the applause fade. I did not make a scene. I did not grab the microphone or proclaim my worth. But inside, something shifted. Silence, which had been forced on me like a muzzle, loosened. I remembered the classrooms I had filled with my voice, the assemblies where I read aloud, the evenings when my late husband listened to me recite poetry at the kitchen table. I remembered the students who wrote me letters years after graduation, telling me that something I said once had stayed with them, guiding them through dark times. My words had mattered. My presence had mattered. And if they mattered once, they could matter again. So yes, the first words of this story are not about where I was born or what I have endured, but about being told not to speak. Because that command, so simple, so quietly cruel, revealed the truth of my place in my daughter's world. Tolerated but not celebrated. Carried but not cherished. Seen only if I kept still. And yet, even as that truth pressed down on me, another rose in defiance. The voice on the loudspeaker calling me guest of honor. Between those two moments, between silencing and announcement, my story begins. The defining act came not in a thunderclap or an open quarrel, but in the simple public confirmation of something I had always feared, but never fully allowed myself to admit. After the announcement of my name as guest of honor echoed across the deck, there was a small reception planned in the ship's lounge, a gathering that to most passengers must have seemed routine. But to me it became the moment of unmasking. A steward approached with a tray of sparkling water and asked if I would follow him, and though my daughter clutched my arm with the grip of someone trying to anchor a balloon before it escapes, I gently slipped away and allowed myself to be guided. The room was bright, filled with chairs arranged in neat rows, and a microphone stood waiting near a simple podium. The cruise director, a man with practiced cheer, introduced me once more to the assembled guests, explaining that each voyage they chose one passenger whose life story deserved a little recognition, someone who carried with them years of contribution, history, or courage. I felt my throat tighten, not from fear of speaking, but from the weight of being acknowledged after so much time in silence. I stood awkwardly, not sure if I was meant to say anything, but before I could decide, my daughter entered the room, her smile stretched thin, her eyes sharp with warning, and she announced loudly enough for all to hear, "Oh, it must be some clerical mistake. My mother is very shy. She doesn't really do public speaking." Those words struck harder than any storm. To dismiss me so quickly, to overwrite my entire history with a casual claim of shyness, when in fact I had spent 4 decades speaking daily to classrooms, reading stories to restless children, delivering lectures to parents, training younger teachers, standing in auditoriums filled with noise and making myself heard, all of that erased with a single sentence. The guest smiled politely, perhaps a little confused, and the director tried to reassure her, but the damage was done. I sat down again, cheeks hot, not with shame, but with fury at being reduced to a fragile object, a decorative silence in her version of reality. In that instant, the truth crystallized. This was not an isolated misstep or a misunderstanding. It was the culmination of years of small acts of diminishment, of careful exclusions, of conversations where I was included only as background. The cruise, which I had imagined as a gift of togetherness, was in fact a stage where my daughter wished to display her curated family, her handsome husband, her well-dressed children, her own polished charm, and where I was cast in the role of mute grandmother, a relic to be wheeled out and put away. My existence was permitted only on her terms, and those terms required that I silence the very thing that defined me, my voice. I remember the steward offering me a glass, the bubbles rising in the flute like tiny rebellions, and I drank it slowly, steadying myself. I watched my daughter whisper hurriedly to the director, watched him nod sympathetically, watched the event dissolve into small talk and dispersal. No one demanded I speak, no one forced me to the podium, and so in the eyes of the room it passed without consequence. But for me it was the final confirmation. I was no longer simply neglected or overlooked. I was being deliberately managed, contained, erased in real time. When the reception ended, she led me back toward the cabin, her steps brisk, her words hissing just under the surface. Why couldn't you just smile and sit quietly? Why do you always make things more complicated than they need to be? People don't want to hear old stories. They don't care about schoolrooms from 50 years ago. Just enjoy the trip, Mom, and let us handle the rest. I wanted to scream then, to tell her that my stories were the very foundation on which her own life was built, that my teaching had shaped hundreds of young minds, that my books still sat on dusty shelves in school libraries across the country. But the hallway was filled with other passengers, and I swallowed it down. That night, in the cabin bunk with the low hum of the engines beneath us, I lay awake long after she and her husband had gone off to some evening show. The curtains were thin. The sea pressed against the glass in endless rhythm, and I stared at the ceiling, thinking of all the times I had chosen silence for the sake of peace. I thought of holidays where I bit my tongue at the dinner table while my children corrected me on modern etiquette. I thought of birthdays where I accepted gifts that were jokes about aging rather than tokens of love. I thought of hospital visits where no one asked how I felt but instead told me what I should do. And now here, on this ship, the culmination. Being introduced as someone worthy of honor, only to have my own daughter erase me with a smile. It was not the embarrassment that pierced me most. It was the realization that she believed her version of me was truth, that in her eyes I really was someone better off unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. A burden to be managed, a shadow to be positioned. That belief had been growing for years, nurtured by small cruelties and disguised as care, and now it bloomed fully in public view. The catalyst was not the applause or the podium or even the refusal. It was the sudden, irreversible recognition that the person I had raised, the girl whose hair I braided and whose tears I dried, now stood as the gatekeeper of my voice, and she had chosen to lock it away. I turned onto my side in the narrow bed and pressed my hands together as if in prayer. Not to any god, but to the memory of myself. I thought of the classroom chalkboards, the smell of dust and ink, the sound of 30 children repeating words after me, voices weaving into something stronger than any one of them alone. I thought of evenings with my husband when we read aloud to each other, his deep laugh breaking the solemnity of the poems. I thought of moments when words had not just been mine, but had been gifts I gave freely, shaping lives. That night, I promised myself quietly that I would not surrender that identity entirely. Even if they tried to bury me in silence, there would come a moment when I would speak, and when I did, it would matter. The catalyst was not a dramatic fight or a tearful confrontation. It was a quiet cutting away of illusion, a sudden shift from hope to clarity. I saw the truth of my daughter's intentions, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The ship moved forward across the dark water, steady and unfeeling, carrying us all toward ports we had not yet imagined. But inside me, another journey had already begun. The journey from silence back to voice, from erasure back to existence, from being managed to choosing myself. The betrayal was complete, but so was the awakening. The days that followed did not explode with overt cruelty, and that was what made them heavier, because it was not in great battles that I began to feel myself dissolve, but in the slow erosion of every small moment. The kind of erosion that wears away a rock not with thunder, but with a million quiet drops of water. After the reception in the lounge, after the fragile smile of my daughter and the brittle laughter she used to cover her discomfort, nothing was said directly, yet everything changed. At breakfast, I found myself seated at the far end of the table, not deliberately exiled, perhaps, but positioned in such a way that conversations flowed past me like a current I was not strong enough to enter. Her children spoke of their games, their shows, their schools, and when I asked questions, they gave one-word answers before turning back to their screens. Her husband discussed investments and travel plans with another couple they had met on board, and each time I leaned forward to contribute, he would nod politely, not unkindly, but with that smile that signals the end of a thread rather than the beginning. My daughter, ever attentive to her performance, filled the silences with anecdotes that made her sound competent and charming, and when I tried to add a detail or a memory, she would place her hand lightly on mine, a gesture that appeared affectionate to outsiders, but which I recognized as a signal to stop, and she would steer the story elsewhere. It is in these gestures, invisible to the rest of the world, that the slow diminishment grows. To anyone watching from another table, I must have seemed included, surrounded by family, cared for, and even indulged. But from my seat, I felt the sharp edge of dismissal in every turn of phrase, every carefully controlled interaction. At the pool, I was guided to a chair in the corner where I was told to relax and enjoy the sun, while they disappeared into the water, laughing, splashing, taking photos of themselves. No one asked if I wanted to swim, though I still knew how, though I remembered the feeling of buoyancy, though I could have joined them had they thought of me not as furniture but as flesh. At dinner, when the servers approached to ask about wine, the question was intercepted before it reached me, as though I had no preference, as though I could not answer for myself. I do not drink much, but I drink when I choose, and the choice was taken silently from me. I noticed, too, the way my daughter spoke about me to others. When another passenger, a woman about my age with kind eyes, asked if I had taught, my daughter answered before I could open my mouth, explaining in brisk tones that yes, I had worked at a small school for many years, nothing remarkable, just local, children, as though 4 decades of shaping minds was a hobby I had dabbled in. When the woman tried to include me by asking what grade I taught, my daughter laughed lightly and said, "Oh, she forgets sometimes, don't you, Mom?" And there it was again. The reduction, the small but powerful denial of my competence, the sly suggestion that my memory was failing, that my authority was no longer intact. I smiled because that is what one does in public when one's dignity is sliced open. But inside, I felt the cut deepening. Nights were the hardest, not because of noise or discomfort, but because silence is loud when you carry it in your chest. I would lie in the cabin listening to the distant music from the entertainment decks, hearing laughter, clapping, and the steady throb of engines. And I would recall my own younger years when my husband and I once saved for months to take a ferry. Trip along the coast, how we had stood side by side at the railing, watching the water spray, sharing sandwiches we had packed ourselves, feeling rich not in money but in togetherness. Now I lay on a narrow bed while my daughter and her husband dressed for gala dinners, while I was told to rest because the evenings were too tiring for me. Tiring, perhaps, but not impossible. Yet I was not invited. The first escalation, then, was not in one grand humiliation, but in the steady layering of smaller ones, each invisible to the outside world, each dismissed as nothing if I dared to protest. The way her husband explained menus to me as though I had never read before. The way her children rolled their eyes when I asked simple questions. The way my daughter translated my words for others, always softening or altering them, as though my own language were dangerous or embarrassing. The way she spoke to staff about me, using phrases like, "She's fine, she just gets confused sometimes." Though I was not confused, though I understood perfectly well what was happening. One afternoon, when we docked at a small port, I was asked if I wanted to come along for the excursion. I said, yes, of course. I would like to see the town, to walk a little, to breathe air that was not filtered by the ship. But when the time came, they left without me. My daughter said I looked tired at breakfast and decided I should stay. And by the time I realized, they were gone, and I was sitting alone in the cabin with the curtain half drawn and the muffled sound of footsteps passing in the hallway. I could have gone by myself, but the paper with excursion details had been taken, the time and place never shared, and so I sat in the quiet, staring at the sea beyond the glass, and felt the hours stretch like punishment. What they never understood is that loneliness among strangers is bearable, even softened by the anonymity of it. But loneliness within family is a wound that does not close. To be ignored by the world is one thing. To be erased by those you created, those you nurtured, those whose voices once depended on yours, is another entirely. That afternoon, as I sat alone, I thought of all the years I had believed that sacrifice would be rewarded with closeness, that giving would return giving, that patience would be met with gratitude. Instead, I realized that silence had not earned me peace, but had trained them to believe it was all I was capable of. The erosion continued in subtle ways. At the buffet, my daughter placed food on my plate without asking what I wanted. At the evening shows, she whispered that I should stay behind because the lights and sounds might overwhelm me. Though I had sat through decades of school plays with screeching microphones and restless audiences, when passengers complimented me on being chosen as guest of honor, she would laugh and say, "Oh, my mother always gets more attention than she deserves." And the words would hang in the air, sugar-coated but sharp, leaving me unable to answer without. Sounding bitter. And yet, even in those moments of diminishment, I began to notice something else. The faint stirrings of defiance within myself. Not yet action, not yet rebellion, but the quiet gathering of strength. Each small humiliation was a stone placed in a pocket, weighing me down, but also reminding me of gravity, reminding me that I was still tethered to truth, that I still recognized myself even when they tried to disguise me. At night, when I could not sleep, I repeated silently the names of my students, the lines of poems I had once recited, the sentences of letters I had received over the years, as though conjuring a chorus of voices that would not let me vanish. So the first escalation was this. Not a collapse, but a slow sinking, Not a storm, but a tide. Not a single betrayal, but the confirmation of many. It was the steady realization that my daughter did not simply forget me in the rush of her life, but actively shaped a version of me that suited her story. And that version was smaller, quieter, diminished. It was the knowledge that if I continued to comply, if I continued to accept the corner seat, the soft hand pressing mine to stop speaking, the decisions made on my behalf, then I would vanish completely, not in death, but in life, erased while still breathing. And once that realization took root, it could not be pulled out. It sat inside me, heavy and undeniable, and I knew, though I did not yet know how, that something within me would have to rise against it. The shift did not come as a thunderbolt, no sudden rebellion that others could point to as drama, but rather as a quiet and private awakening, the kind that creeps into you slowly until one day you realize you have crossed a threshold. It happened, oddly enough, in the most ordinary way. During one of the afternoons when I had slipped away from my family and wandered alone along the quieter decks, those parts of the ship where only a few passengers lingered, where the music from the pool could barely be heard, and the air smelled of salt and steel. I had brought with me a copy of the ship's daily bulletin, a little pamphlet they tucked under our doors each morning, filled with announcements about excursions, shows, and special features. I had never paid it much attention before, but that day I sat in a deck chair, with the sea stretching endless and blue, and I noticed a column titled Passenger Spotlight. There, printed in simple black letters, was a brief profile of me. My name, my hometown, and a short paragraph about my years as a teacher, the children's books I had once written, and the fact that several generations of students still remembered me. It was nothing grand, only a few sentences, but to me it felt like someone had thrown a rope across a chasm. For years I had felt myself dissolve into invisibility, yet here was proof, written and distributed to every cabin, that my life had substance, that my work mattered. I held the paper for a long time, tracing the letters with my finger as if to remind myself they were real. I could almost hear the voices of my students again, could almost feel the chalk between my fingers, could almost remember what it was like to stand in front of a room and be listened to. For so long, my daughter's narrative of me had become dominant, the fragile, confused, retired woman who ought to sit quietly, that seeing another version, however small, shocked me into remembering who I truly was. That evening, when my daughter tried once more to guide me toward a corner seat at dinner, I felt something shift inside. I let her steer me, but I no longer believed in her control. When she intercepted a question meant for me, I smiled and answered it anyway, calmly, without apology. The table grew still for a moment, surprised, but no disaster occurred. The sky did not fall. No one gasped in horror. They simply listened politely and nodded. The realization was startling. The prison had never been locked. My silence had been enforced by habit and fear, but the door was always ajar. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual and decided to take breakfast alone on the open deck. My daughter was irritated when she discovered my absence, scolding me gently as if I were a child who had wandered off. But I sipped my coffee in the sun and let her words roll past me. I realized that small choices were possible, that I did not need to wait for permission to exist. I began to notice how often I had ceded space, how willingly I had accepted being sidelined, how thoroughly I had trained myself to comply. And with each realization came a question. What if I stopped? What if I claimed even 1 hour, one story, one decision for myself? The shift was not visible to them, not yet. Outwardly, I still complied with the itinerary, attended the meals, nodded when spoken to. But inwardly, I had begun to catalog moments of quiet resistance. I chose my own food at the buffet, ignoring the plate my daughter prepared for me. I struck up conversation with a young steward about his hometown, and though my daughter frowned when she noticed, I did not stop. I even joined a trivia game one afternoon, pairing with strangers. And when our team won, I laughed so loudly that for a moment I startled myself. It felt like oxygen filling a chest that had been starved too long. The turning point, though, came one night when I stood again on the deck beneath the stars. The sea was vast and black, the ship cutting through it like a blade, and the wind pressed against me in steady rhythm. I thought of the many times in my life when I had waited for others to invite me, to give me space, to grant me dignity. I thought of my husband's death, after which I'd waited years for my children to see me not as a widow to be pitied, but as a woman still alive. I thought of the decades of teaching, where I had given my voice freely to others, only to find myself voiceless at home, and standing there with the night so immense it made me feel both small and infinite. I decided quietly that I would not wait any longer. The shift was not dramatic, but it was decisive. I would not beg for their recognition. I would not argue for my worth. I would not shout or demand. Instead, I would act, in ways large or small, that confirmed to me and to the world that I still existed as more than background. I would choose when to speak and when to be silent, not because I was told, but because I decided. And in that decision, in that subtle but irreversible reclaiming, I felt the tide turn inside me. The cruise was no longer their gift to me, it was my stage of awakening. I had been instructed not to speak, and yet here I was, gathering words again, preparing, without even knowing it fully, for the moment when my voice would no longer be contained. The past always has a way of returning when you begin to step away from it, and it rarely does so with kindness. The first days of my quiet rebellion had felt almost secret, like a small fire kept inside the folds of my coat, warming me though no one else could see it. I thought perhaps I could keep it hidden, carry it silently through the remainder of the voyage, let it give me strength without demanding confrontation. But life, and especially family, rarely allow such privacy. And soon enough the pressure to return to my old role grew heavier, more insistent, as though the ship itself conspired to test whether my shift was real or only temporary. It began subtly, the way these things always do. My daughter noticed my small departures from obedience, the conversations I initiated with staff, the way I lingered after breakfast to walk the deck alone, the decision to join strangers for a trivia game. She masked her irritation beneath laughter, joking to her husband that I was making friends everywhere. But in her eyes, I saw the unease of someone who feels control slipping. One evening she pulled me aside before dinner. Her smile stretched tight, and told me gently but firmly that people on board might misunderstand me if I was too forward, that it was better if I let her handle introductions and explanations. I listened, nodded once, and then walked past her into the dining hall, claiming my seat without waiting for her direction. It was a small thing, but I felt her fury simmering beside me all through the meal, disguised as cheerful conversation. The escalation deepened when an older couple at the table, kind people from Canada, asked me about my teaching years. I began to answer, telling them about the generations of children I had guided, about the books I had written, about the joy of watching reluctant readers discover their own voices. They listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, and for a few moments I felt myself restored. Not a relic, but a storyteller. Not an ornament, but a person. Yet even as I spoke, I saw my daughter's jaw tighten, her eyes flicking nervously toward her husband. At last she interrupted, laughing as though to lighten the mood, and said, "Oh, Mom always tells her school stories. You'll never get her to stop once she begins." The table chuckled politely, but the words stung like a slap, reducing my life's work to a tiresome habit, a long-winded bore. I wanted to scream that she had no right to erase me with a joke, but I swallowed it, because dignity sometimes requires silence even when silence tastes like ashes. The second escalation was not just her irritation, but the ways in which she began to tighten her hold, as though afraid I might embarrass her with my very existence. At the next port, she suggested firmly that I stay aboard while they explored the city, telling me the streets would be too crowded, the walking too difficult, the heat too strong. I insisted on going, and though she relented outwardly, she made sure to walk ahead with her husband and children, leaving me trailing behind, a solitary figure moving at her own pace while they disappeared into the crowds. I stopped at a small shop filled with local crafts, speaking with the shopkeeper about the woven textiles, and when my daughter returned to find me, she was furious that I had spoken at length to a stranger, as though conversation were betrayal. "You don't know these people," she whispered harshly, her grip on my arm leaving bruises. "You don't know what they might think." I looked at her then and realized it was not my safety she feared for, but her own image, the illusion of control she had, built so carefully. The pressure grew sharper in the evenings, when she and her husband began to discuss me openly in front of the children, not cruelly, not with raised voices, but with those soft tones that sound like care, yet are heavy with condescension. "Grandma is tired. She needs rest. She shouldn't come to the show tonight. Grandma forgets sometimes. We'll explain it for her. Grandma doesn't like spicy food. Better order something simple." The children absorbed these cues without question, nodding, barely glancing at me, already learning that I was an object to be managed rather than a voice to be heard. It was not just my daughter now, it was her entire family rehearsing the script of my erasure. But the most brutal blow came unexpectedly during one of the formal dinners near the midpoint of the voyage. The captain himself came to our table, a charming man with silver hair, greeting us warmly and thanking me again for being the guest of honor. He asked me how I was enjoying the trip, and I began to answer, speaking of the sea, of the beauty of the ports, of the kindness of the staff. My daughter interrupted me halfway through my sentence, smiling too brightly, and said, "She gets overwhelmed sometimes, Captain, but she's having a wonderful time, aren't you, Mom?" I froze. The words stuck in my throat, and nodded mutely because to contradict her in that moment would have been to cause a scene, and I had been trained all my life not to make scenes. The captain smiled politely and moved on, but inside I felt something collapse, a bone breaking that would never set again. Later that night, I returned to the cabin alone and stood before the mirror. I looked at my face, the lines carved by years of work and worry, the eyes that had once commanded a room, now dulled by the endless effort of being erased. I whispered aloud softly, "I am not confused. I am not tired. I am not finished." Hearing my own voice startled me, as though a stranger had spoken in the room, and in that moment I realized that the escalation had reached its peak. My daughter was not simply dismissing me, she was rewriting me, turning me into someone fragile, incompetent and voiceless in the eyes of everyone around us. If I allowed it to continue, soon even I might believe it. The next day I tested the boundaries again. I signed up for a morning lecture on marine life without telling her, slipping away after breakfast to sit among strangers and listen to the naturalists speak of whales and tides. The lecturer asked if anyone remembered learning about ecosystems in school, and I raised my hand, telling briefly of the unit I had taught for years, how children love to trace food chains and imagine themselves as part of the cycle of life. The room laughed warmly, applauded lightly, and for a moment I felt whole again. But when I returned to the cabin, my daughter was waiting, her face stiff with anger. She demanded to know where I had been, why I had wandered off, what people might think. I told her calmly that I had gone to learn, that I was allowed to listen and to speak. Her fury was quiet, contained, but it burned hotter than any shouting could. She told me I was selfish, that I was making the trip harder for everyone, that I was embarrassing myself without realizing it. I listened, I nodded, but inside I thought, no, I am not embarrassing myself. I am embarrassing you, because I refuse to vanish. The second escalation reached its truest form in that tension, the tug of war between their desperate need to contain me and my growing refusal to be contained. Every smile of hers became sharper, every gesture of care more controlling, every explanation of my supposed confusion more insistent. The more I resisted, the more she pressed down, until the air between us was thick with unspoken conflict. And yet, beneath the weight of her disapproval, I felt stronger. I felt the stirring of the woman I once was, the teacher who stood in noisy classrooms and demanded to be heard, the mother who survived grief and loss, the writer who carved stories into pages that outlived her own youth. I was returning quietly but firmly, and the harder she tried to silence me, the louder that return became inside my own chest. So the second escalation was not simply their pressure, it was also my awakening tested, stretched, forced to prove itself. It was the realization that reclaiming one's voice is never simple, never private, never without resistance from those who prefer the silence. It was the painful awareness that my daughter would not celebrate my strength but fear it, and that to stand fully as myself I would have to endure her disappointment, her anger, even her rejection. And though that thought ached like a bruise pressed too hard, I knew, with a clarity sharper than the salt air, that the time was coming when I would no longer nod and comply, no longer sit quietly in the corner, no longer accept erasure as my role. The time was coming when I would speak, not only for myself, but for every moment of silence that had been forced upon me. And once I did, there would be no turning back. The moment came on the final gala night of the voyage, the evening that was supposed to showcase families in glittering clothes, a celebration of elegance and belonging, the kind of staged performance that my daughter adored. She had spent the afternoon fussing over her children's outfits, adjusting ties and smoothing skirts, and she pressed a sequined shawl into my hands, instructing me to wear it instead of the simple navy dress I had chosen. I took it without protest, though I draped it loosely over my shoulders rather than fastening it as she directed, because something in me had already decided that I would no longer wear costumes designed to hide me. The dining hall shimmered with lights. Waiters carried trays of champagne, and a string quartet played at the edge of the stage. My daughter walked ahead, her heels clicking proudly, her husband beside her. Their children rehearsed into picture-perfect smiles. I followed, steady, my heart beating with the rhythm of the engines beneath the floor, aware that something had to break tonight. The captain and cruise director made their welcoming remarks, thanking the passengers for joining the voyage, listing the ports we had visited, praising the staff, and then, as I suspected they might, they announced the guest of honor once more. My name filled the room again, clear and strong, and people turned their heads toward me, applauding politely. I felt my daughter stiffen beside me, her hand tightening on my wrist, whispering through clenched teeth, "Just smile and nod, please. Don't say anything. Just let them finish." But the sound of my own name had awakened something in me too powerful to ignore. For days I had swallowed the words, rising in my throat. For years I had bitten my tongue to preserve peace. But tonight, under the bright lights of the ship, I could no longer accept being silenced. I stood. My chair scraped softly against the polished floor, a sound louder in my ears than the music, and I walked slowly toward the small podium. There were no protests at first, only surprise, a few murmurs, my daughter's voice hissing behind me like steam escaping from a kettle. But I kept walking until I stood under the light. The microphone waited, and I placed my hand on it, steady though I expected it to tremble. I looked at the room, at the rows of faces turned toward me, strangers, staff, families, and I felt the vastness of the sea beyond the walls, holding us all. My daughter tried to interject, calling out, "She's not comfortable speaking. It's really a mistake." But I leaned closer to the microphone, and my voice, when it came, was clear, calm, and steady. I was told not to speak to anyone. The sentence dropped into the room like a stone into water, rippling outward. For a moment there was silence, not hostile but waiting, a silence that invited more. I continued. On the first day of this voyage, my daughter leaned close and instructed me to keep quiet, to let others do the talking, to simply smile. And for days I obeyed, not because I had nothing to say, but because I have spent much of my life believing that silence was the price of peace. But tonight, as my name is spoken aloud, I remember that my voice is still mine, and I will not leave this ship without using it. The room had grown still. The music ceased. Forks lowered quietly onto plates. I spoke of my years in the classroom, of the children who had arrived shy and left bold, of the books I had written, of the joy and pain of a life that had meaning beyond silence. I did not ramble. I did not shout. I did not accuse. But I allowed the truth to flow with the weight of all the years I had been asked to hold it in. I told them that being old does not mean being finished, that being quiet does not mean having nothing to say, that invisibility is not a natural state, but an imposed one, and that each woman of my age deserves to be heard before the world decides. She has vanished. I could see my daughter in the crowd, her face pale, her smile brittle, her eyes flashing with humiliation, but I did not look away. I had spent too many years lowering my gaze, too many years yielding to her discomfort, and now I held her stare while I spoke. I saw her children watching me too, wide-eyed, uncertain, perhaps even hearing me for the first time as more than the background figure they had been trained to dismiss. The cruise director stood nearby, uneasy but respectful, letting me continue, and I realized that no one was stopping me, that the only barriers had been the ones my family built, and I accepted. When I finished, I did not wait for applause. I stepped back from the microphone, folded my hands, and returned to my seat, my back straighter, my breath steady. The room clapped politely, some more warmly than others, but I did not measure the worth of my words by their approval. The worth was in the speaking itself, in the fact that I had reclaimed what had been stolen from me, the right to tell my own story. My daughter leaned toward me, her voice shaking with fury disguised as calm, and whispered, "Why would you do that? You've embarrassed us all." I turned to her slowly and answered, softly but firmly, "No, my dear." For once, I honored myself. That night, back in the cabin, the silence between us was colder than the ocean wind. She did not speak to me, and her husband avoided my eyes, while the children scrolled through their devices, retreating into their digital worlds. But I felt no regret. For the first time in years, I slept without the heavy weight of unsaid words pressing against my chest. I dreamed of my classroom, of children raising their hands eagerly, of laughter echoing down hallways, of my husband's voice telling me that my words mattered. I woke with the dawn, and though the ship still carried us to the same destination, I knew I had already arrived somewhere new. The climax was not in applause or recognition from strangers, though that was kind. It was in the simple act of refusing to be erased. It was in standing under the lights and speaking not for their approval, but for my own survival. It was in reclaiming the voice that had been locked away, in showing myself that even now, even at 78, I could break the script that others tried to force upon me. That night, something closed forever between my daughter and me, but something else opened, vast and steady, like the sea itself, the knowledge that I had chosen myself, and that choice could not be undone. The morning after the gala felt different, though the ship itself continued its steady rhythm across the waves. The crew moved with the same efficiency, and the passengers bustled through corridors toward breakfast as though nothing at all had shifted. Yet within me there was a quiet stillness, a calm that comes only after a long storm has spent itself. My daughter avoided my gaze, her movements sharp, her words clipped, her husband spoke little, and the children, sensing the tension, buried themselves in their phones. But I was not disturbed. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain myself, no compulsion to apologize for having taken space, no desire to smooth the discomfort of others. It was as though I had been carrying an invisible weight pressed onto my chest for decades, and in a single night, by speaking aloud, I had set it down. When I walked the deck alone that morning, the sea was bright and endless. The wind tugged playfully at my shawl, and a few passengers I did not know stopped to smile at me, nodding as though they understood, as though they had heard something the offer night before that lingered in them too. One woman touched my hand lightly and whispered, "Thank you," though she did not say for what. Perhaps she too had been silenced. Perhaps she too carried words locked inside. Perhaps she simply recognized the shape of defiance in another. Whatever it was, the acknowledgement warmed me, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that my words might have reached beyond myself. I thought then of all the years when I had believed silence was strength, when I had chosen to withhold my truth to preserve the fragile harmony of family gatherings, when I had convinced myself that endurance was dignity. Perhaps at times it was, but too often it became erasure, a slow disappearance I did not notice until I was nearly gone. On that ship, in front of strangers, I reversed that disappearance. I did not regain my youth, nor erase the lines of age, nor suddenly restore myself to the center of my daughter's life, but I reclaimed something far more essential: the right to exist as myself until the very end. Back in my cabin, I packed my suitcase with steady hands. Each folded blouse, each carefully placed book, felt like a gesture of self-possession, as though I were reclaiming not only my belongings, but my story. My daughter came in once, hovering, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. She closed the door again, retreating. Perhaps she felt betrayed, perhaps ashamed, perhaps simply angry that her version of me had cracked in front of others. I did not chase her, nor did I crave reconciliation in that moment. I had learned something vital, that peace built on my silence was not peace at all but submission, and I would no longer trade myself for harmony. On the final morning, as the ship approached the harbor, the loudspeaker announced disembarkation procedures. The passengers gathered their belongings, and the crew lined the corridors to bid farewell. The cruise director smiled at me warmly, shaking my hand, thanking me again, and I saw in his eyes not pity but respect. My daughter hurried past with her family, eager to disappear into the crowd, but I lingered, letting the moment stretch, breathing deeply of the salt air one last time. The city's skyline grew closer, shimmering in the early light, and I felt no sorrow that the voyage was ending, because my true journey had already carried me further than the ship ever could. Now back in my small apartment with its thin walls and its view of the street, I find myself walking lighter. The solitude remains, but it is no longer emptiness. It is space that belongs wholly to me. I make tea in the mornings. I read aloud to myself sometimes, letting the sound of my own voice fill the rooms, and I smile at the echo because it is proof that I am still here. I write letters I may never send, not to justify myself but to remember in ink the truths I refuse to bury again. And when I pass neighbors in the hall, I greet them, not with the shrinking politeness of someone who fears being dismissed, but with the quiet assurance of someone who knows she has spoken when it mattered. If another woman my age were to ask me what I learned on that voyage, I would tell her this: do not wait for permission to speak. Do not confuse their discomfort with your shame. Do not surrender your story for the sake of their peace. We are not relics. We are not furniture. We are not shadows. We are the keepers of lives that still pulse with meaning, and our words are not burdens but bridges. Even if your voice trembles, even if your family rolls their eyes, even if they turn away in anger, speak anyway. Because silence is the slowest kind of death, and words are the only proof that we are still alive. So yes, my daughter told me not to speak to anyone. She wanted me invisible, convenient, obedient. But I spoke, and in speaking, I saved myself.